So I started this tape again. It's going very well. One of the in a vague sense, from the outside, the peak with Boardwatch as part of the BBS industry really seems to center around the BBS cons and the creation of them, because there you've got this, and by that I don't mean like on a pure economic or influence level, but just simply here's the most obvious in-your-face example of here's all these people that are assembling in it. And I just spoke to Greg Ryan of Exec PC, and he just marveled at the quality of the hotel you chose for the first one. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just the Pomona County Holiday Inn that you chose. The Hummer giveaway seems to have had a very wide influence on a lot of people.
A lot of things happen in funny ways. The BBS Con trade show was entirely Phil Becker's idea, actually. And he had to get me down on the floor and arm wrestle me to make it happen. And he wanted me to do it with him. There were a number of uncomfortable elements about it. For me, I sat in a dark room in the Colorado mountains and wrote stuff and mailed it to people. This show required me to get up and speak in front of them. And it was quite a learning experience to be able to do that. I eventually got to where I could, to their satisfaction anyway. But Phil is the one that really got that off the ground. He actually would come over to my house and talk about it endlessly. I finally gave him a check, said, okay, here's my half, let's go do it. But I feared it would be a lot of work and fairly thankless. I was accurate then, actually. These shows are tremendously difficult to do, the way we did them. But it got to be a gig on its own, and it was fed by a couple of things. We actually changed the way computer shows are done in this country, and in an interesting and good way. And I learned a lot doing it. The biggest thing that was rewarding, our initial innovation was, as you say, the meetings that they had were in Howard Johnson's in Kansas, where it would be cheap, because the fuzzy people like cheap. And they would usually be miserable little gatherings, culminating in some sort of a big brouhaha fight, and then everybody went home segmented. My theory about the people that were involved in most of this was that they, in the general population, they were somewhat thinly spread. In other words, you would have someone who did this and did a lot of it in a town where there might be another guy that did it too. In a large city, there was 10 or 15 of these people. And they spent a lot of time indoors and in the basement. They would actually develop animosities without ever meeting, entirely done in a very narrow bandwidth of electronic mail. When in reality they had more in common than they had with any other people on the planet. And my interest in the first BBS Con was to find out what would happen if you actually put them all in one room and let them interact with each other. We chose the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs, largely at Phil Becker's behest. He liked the hotel. It was very upscale, and it made the most expensive gathering that any bulletin board system operator had ever attended. They just cranial detonations at what the room prices were, the registration, everything about it was just entirely too expensive, and no one would go. Except that actually a lot of people did come, to the point where we overflowed the hotel. We had to have sessions and vendor space in the same space and roll it. It was actually, we would have done it at the Broadmoor Hotel forever, except we outgrew it the first year. A couple of things that I learned, and I think they learned as well, is one, it feels good to be kind of upscale and in a good place and a pretty place, and doing, with the good food and the good rooms and so forth. And the other one was, as I suspected, all of a sudden here's 600 or 700 people, and instead of being the one kind of weird guy in every crowd you go into, who nobody knows what you're talking about or why you would be interested in that, suddenly you're in a room with several hundred other people who are interested in almost exactly the same thing, many of which know almost as much as you do about it, and a few of which know more than you do about it. And if you could just talk to them for a few minutes, you might learn something. The release was palpable. The room was just charged. These people would edge into the room again, not always socially the most charming and adroit. But after the initial ice breaking and when the conversation started, there was like this huge aha response. I'm home. I'm among people that, are like me, and I'm not alone. There's a lot of people like me. And so they actually would get into vying with each other to see who was the most out there, and the most avant-garde, the most on the edge, and the most nerdish, or the most, and so forth. And so it got to be, from the beginning, a very fun event. It didn't have the organizational angst of IFNA and FidoNet and so forth. We didn't have to do anything. We were there to celebrate it in a way, and to revisit old friendships and make new ones, and exchange technical information. And that was, at that time, computer conferences typically had one or perhaps two tracks with 4 sessions in each one. And that was it. By the time we got done with ISPCon, we were doing 250 sessions in 3.5 days. At times, 20 rooms wide. Trying to, again, provide something for everyone that had any chance of being a significant thing. It got to be the place to introduce new technologies and new schemata ways of doing things, and so it became a very exciting event because this was where you found out the latest and talked to different people. And of course, at the end, it was the swap shop for buying and selling each other, and so it got to be a very intense conference. And we largely as a part of some of Phil Becker's theories of how to do them. Most of these trade shows, they provide space and a place. We did an event that was scheduled, planned to what chairs were where, at what time, and who put them there, from the moment these people arrived until they got on the plane to go home. It was very elaborately planned, and we would work for 12 months out of the year to do a 3-day show. It was an immense amount of work and an immense amount of money, but they were very successful, and they served admirably to foster the growth of the industry and to accelerate its development. It was one of the better things we did, and I would give credit for the original idea of it to Phil Becker. In the end, he and I sort of parted on very good terms. He was busy doing something, and I was busy doing something, and I wound up doing the ISP cons. But he went through an IPO with his company, and for a lot of reasons that wasn't a good match. To take a privately held company and a publicly traded company and have them do things together is kind of awkward. So.
And he seems to have moved on to digital ID. Seems to be his big thing now.
That seems to be the last I spoke with him. That was the.
And in fact, the point that when I find stuff on him, right? There is really no connection now that he's the ESOP guy and the TVBS and BBSCon guy. He's Mr. Digital ID. His previous persona is almost obliterated. There's really no, Phil Becker started off doing. In fact, it was rather a surprise. onto something.
That he's probably onto something. The number 2 item causing complaints to the Federal Trade Commission is identity theft. And he's kind of working in the center of the, again, emerging industry of hardware, software, and techniques to validate that people are who they say they are. A lot of people don't realize how central an issue this is. Basically, your name, Jason Scott, is designed to be unique within the range that a man can ride on a horseback. And in a 25 square mile area, as long as you're not downtown New York, it's reasonably unique. If you take in a 100-mile radius, it's not unique anymore. There gets to be a number of Jason Scotts. And if you do it on a national basis of 260 million people that we can do electronically, you could have a convention the size of ISPCon just of Jason Scotts. Thousands of them. And so there's some inherent and basic problems in it anyway. But then this concept of e-commerce and how you validate that someone is who they say they are becomes almost absurd.
Yeah, that's what I meant by film. I was like, is that actually Phil Becker? Yes, it's Phil Becker. There's Phil Becker posing and everything else.
At the Wireless ISP convention that they had in Dallas in September or October, I ran into a little group of people. Apparently, the Heart of ZSoft thing was a little program that actually I originally took and cobbled together from some pieces and gave to Phil and talked him into making this. And that's what ESoft became when it went public. It was essentially an interface for the Internet. And he called it the iPad and recoded the whole thing and made it work good. That software has kind of fallen out of the company, and this group of people have taken it over and are adding code to it in kind of an open source type fashion. And he was talking about Phil and the iPad, so he's still got some lingering things from his past too. But
yeah, they have these conventions every year for the iPad,
uh-huh.
And I even Glib runs off one. Mm-hmm. Because Glib still kind of provides ISP connectivity in there, and he had nothing but the greatest things to say about how well designed. The one, I mean, not to go too heavily into Phil, but yeah, the one thing that Phil really leads in his each one of the giants like yourself, and Phil and Tom Jennings and so on, leave a trail of either accurate or semi-inaccurate impressions on people. Mm-hmm. And the one with Phil Becker is just that he made solid software that just wouldn't go down, and that it worked. And yes, it was expensive if you didn't consider quality of value. And so, it's one of those things. And then I found out from him that he worked on one of the Apollo missions.
Mm-hmm. The Phil's philosophy, and I've kind of adopted it, particularly with regards to software. Is that the cost of the software is really in the support, and the less users you have, the better. And so he would price it accordingly. If you wanted it in the club, you had to pay the freight. That iPad was originally, I took a look at some stuff that Phil Karn, K9Q did, and cobbled together something and got a bulletin board system up and running on the Internet, and had Phil come over. And you could dial into this bulletin board, drop to the command line, tell that out, and back into the bulletin board, drop to the command line, tell that out to another site, log back into the bulletin board over the Internet. And I had this thing in a loop that was tied up like 16 cities, and it was right in front of me. And I was just fascinated by it. And I had a brother-in-law, Clyde Glastetter, worked on it a little bit, and Phil was, not interested, and I finally showed him this thing, and he did it. I also wrote a email interface for his BBS software. He had a multi-line bulletin board called TBBS that I ran, and I wanted him to do internet email, and he wouldn't do it. And his software was all written in assembly language, and I wrote assembly language. So I actually wrote the only assembly language implementation of UCP that was ever written, and got it to exchange mail with the internet end, and then got it to work with Phil's database, and finally got him interested and got the hooks into his actual software and wrote a module for it, where it would, if you got on his bulletin board and entered an internet email message, it would find another unused line, dial out and deliver the message to the internet while you were still on there. And eventually I called it the Personal Internet Mail Processor, PIMP. And that was because I didn't want to deal with news groups. Well, the people that bought it, of course, their first request was that do news groups. So eventually I had to do news groups too. So it failed in the naming, but I wrote PIMP and eventually sold it to Phil. And he made it part of the TBBS suite. And so we did a lot of projects like that, back and forth together. And he was an excellent coder. Yes, he was worked at Martin Marietta, not on Apollo. It was on the Viking Mars lander. And I worked with Martin Marietta for 5 years. So, yeah, a lot of the people that got into this hobby, into this thing, were, defense contractors and IBM Unisys and so forth. It wasn't entirely people that woke up one day and, said, "Oh, I think I'll learn about this." There was a lot of technical.
I have interviewed a lot of people who were very much like kids and did kid stuff. And I mean, that's a separate strata. I mean, it's very obviously a separate strata. I mean, you were not going to be doing a whole lot of information on World War IV or Oblivion or Iniquity or all these other boards because they were essentially written by children for children. Mm-hmm. They're fascinating in their own range, but they're separate. They really are.
Oh, there was a kid in Denver named Adam Hudson who eventually went to work for Phil, actually. But Adam wanted TBBS software and couldn't afford it. So he wrote a single-line version of TBBS. I don't remember what he called it. Something. But it was excellent software. He was 12 years old. And years later, I think he worked for Phil for a while. But he became an excellent coder, but he started that project to make TBBS because he wanted it and couldn't pay Phil's freight. And so he wrote one of his own in C, I think. And it would do just a single line, but it was kind of a blatant ripoff of the way TBBS did things with the setup files and so forth. It was a good effort. His name was Adam Hudson. I can't remember the name of the bulletin board software. But he literally was a kid, and I mean, like 12 years old when he did this first version. And I actually ran his software for a while. It was a good product.
There's, when I spoke to Scott Brinker of Galacticon, among his memories of BBSCon are that the first one is a big surprise in its success. Uh-huh. But the second one is the one where everyone has caught their breath, figured out that it is a big thing, it's going to be a big thing, and that's when you have the luau and a bunch of,
Actually, you're right. The first one was at the Stouffer Inn in Denver. The second one was Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs. And yeah, we had a thing that was like a steak cookout up on top of a mountain, type thing. It was, no, they got used to the idea that it was going to be a big deal, and they came back the next year and we got them again. We jacked it up another level, and it was pretty much cranial detonations. Those were good days. real good days.
Were there any triumphs around? You can do either Boardwatch or the BBS Con. You know, the things where things happened and you were just really pleased it all came together and worked out.
Well, yeah, it was pretty much a continuous stream of them. You have to have them to work 16 hours a day for 12 years. The BBS cons, particularly the early ones, there was a lot of financial risk and a lot of effort went into them. And it hadn't really been done before. Most of the meetings, like I say, were sort of FidoNet type conventions that were more or less disasters, I thought. And so a lot of our theories about a gathering were proven not only true, but sort of explosively true. Boardwatch itself from the beginning had a pretty good reception. I mean, we built it a little bit at a time as the industry grew, but that was very gratifying. Any particular moment of success, I would say on top of that mountain that the Broadmoor was kind of the pretty intense.
Yeah, I unfortunately don't have this exact detail. There was something where you organized some kind of get together, and it was just a little thing. You said, like, we ought to do this, and it wasn't at a BBS con, it was somewhere else, and it was huge. That's what I mean. When I fish for people about, what do you remember with Jack? They just tend to remember a very big skies kind of attitude. Not just, well, if we're going to do 5 of them, why don't we just do 500 of them? Right. And if you're going to sit here and have, this kind of group, why not just invite every group and then just, handle that? So in every single move, it's not just, and that this, so as a result, that's where you get things like, the BBS companies, instead of just taking it quietly and opening up, like I said, a 1/8-page ad, suddenly they'll have 4 or 5-page spreads, full color saying this thing in here, and they'll have pictures of themselves in there, and there's like that real sense of just, don't just succeed, exceed kind of a deal.
I wouldn't put it exactly that way, but one of the things that I do a little bit differently, I think, is sort of measure effort against gain. You start with the good outcome. If you're going to do this documentary, and what would it look like if everything went beyond your wildest imaginings and it just got to be something fantastic? Well, my view is, let's start there and work our way back toward reality. Right? Don't start here and say, well, what if I did a little bit of this and a little bit of that and took another little baby step? Okay, let's design the end box I want. What's the good outcome? I mean, this was a standard phrase between me and Phil. What's the good outcome? What happens here if we get wet? Everything works great. And let's just design it that way. And then along the way, reality has its own way of intervening and inserting certain compromises and certain steps backward to be able to bring it off. But if you start at the ultimate ideal end thing, and so it was a common flux in interacting with people in that industry that we're trying to do this. Well, why are you trying to do that? Why would anybody want that if it got done? Because that would lead to this. And you talk to them for a few minutes, and I'd finally tell them, well, look, Bart, let's cut to the chase. If everything went great, what's the end look like where it all worked? Well, it looked like this. Well, all right, then why don't we start there and work backwards? It's better to have a big dream and not quite get there than to have a little dream and get there real quick and then you don't have any more dream left. So that was sort of my approach, and the one that I, if you will, coached to anybody that came usually with some half-step, half-measure thing. Well, why don't you go for what you really want to have happen? You can always fall back to something lesser later.
And again, I always caveat these things, we can go here if we want to or not, but, the fact that Phil runs one of the main 5 or 6 competing software packages is so tightly intertwined with BoardWatch. I don't know what your opinion was at the time or the opinion now with that situation, because I do have some slight unhappiness from, for a good example is Rob Swindell of Synchronet.
Synchronet.
Yeah, Synchronet. I've talked to the different guys in different ways, but for instance, he's one who really feels like the fix was on, and how he felt about things, and then when he looks back on it, and he was tiny compared to the other guys, but he thought he was, up there, and again, it's a case of, it's been 10 years, so, just, not even so much with Synchronet, but just, it's an unusual situation sometimes.
In a small industry like that, there are inevitably conflicts and conflicts of interest. And so I had to deal with those fairly early on a much wider scale than that. I guess my biggest criticism of media in general is that they have developed a sense of journalistic ethics that has largely let everyone that plays off the hook for being honest. I'd say there were a lot of people who disagreed with things that I wrote and things that I said, and some of them were the nature of opinions is they're not absolute. There's always a couple of sides. But I had very few people along the way question my honesty that got to know us. If the fix was in, Phil Becker and TVBS, I can assure you, would have wound up owning all of bulletin boards and the internet. But they didn't. And we had a long association. He's a very close friend of mine. And there are certain things that I'll ask him to do, and there are certain things that he'll ask me to do. And there are certain things that I won't ask him to do, and there are certain things he won't ask me. And we were very comfortable with each other that way. And I think we ran an honest shop. I don't think the fix was in. And I'm pretty confident in that. Had the fix been in, he would have won. And largely, TVBS was not the most widely adopted bulletin board software, nor was it the largest financial success in BBS software.
Yeah, Wildcat seems to be the faraway winner on that level.
They built quite a company. Galacticom had quite a thing going for a while. I'd say, but there were multiple players that achieved approximately the same size in staff and revenues. So if the fix was in, why wasn't Phil in?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And realistically, it wasn't in my commercial interest for Phil to be it, or to even treat him any differently than the other ones. Not that that's actually what drove BoardWatch, but if ulterior motives are ascribed, I would want the maximum number of players, each of them taking a page.
For you, by say, I think by 90, certainly by 91, 93, that's when you are with no doubt, a full-fledged magazine able to stand up against any magazine in the publishing industry. As we cover this, we have full color, we have a large staff, and by large staff I mean, a large group of contributors and so on. What had Boardwatch become for you by then?
Well, it was my life. I actually ate my family and everything else. I worked typically 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for many years, without a day off. I lived it, breathed it, ate it, and loved it. And loved every minute of it. I worked one day for 42 hours. That's tough to do in one day, but I did. And the only thing I got up for was to pee and get another cup of coffee for 42 hours straight. I loved it. I loved every minute of it. It was like being in a war, except more exciting. And I loved everything about it.
As a certainly then when media or other entities wanted a BBS expert, they knew to come to you, or at least to come to you to ask who to talk to. Was there any group or entity or event that really surprised you that they would, I think it was, like David Terry mentioned to me that at one point he was asked to go speak to the FBI about how to do a bulletin board, how bulletin boards work, because they needed information. And so he was flown by helicopter out of Utah to D.C. to a location, and he was like, okay, that's great, came back in the helicopter, okay, I guess that was something. It just really surprised him, being this. But was there anything for you like that where you found yourself in a room of unusual people or being approached by some sort of entity that surprised you?
Yeah, a couple of times. Brett Hume used to call. He had actually a history in this, going back to a little Radio Shack Model 100 laptop with a modem built in. And he was fascinated by bulletin boards and online services. And he'd call once in a while and just want to talk about, cool ways to hook things up. And I always thought that was odd because I'd see him on TV later. We heard from every major news organization. I guess the one thing that took me aback in that vein, the only thing I can relate, was some guys from Ziff Davis. In my mind, we were a little newsletter up until the moment I left. We were little and ugly, and our mother dressed us funny, and so forth. Ziff Davis was the largest magazine publisher in the world. They published PC Magazine, they had Computer Shopper. They were it, the top of the heap. And I had 3 or 4 of them pull me aside at a BBS con one day, and we were drinking and kibitzing, and they told me that the reason, didn't I find it funny, that Ziff didn't have a modem magazine or communications magazine, like Boardwatch. I said, well, I don't know, I never really thought about it a whole lot. And they said, well, they're scared to death of you. They've had meetings over you every 6 months for the last 4 or 5 years. I don't want to spend the money to go against you. You own it, and they can't figure out a way to take it away. So that was kind of a lifter for me. That's, in my mind, they're the biggest computer magazine company in the world. And actually, they treated me very graciously all along. John Dvorak started writing for us about 91 or 92 now. I had been a fan of his when he was the back page of InfoWorld in the early 80s. This guy was just, my hero. And I talked him into writing a column for us. Well, he was actually sort of on an exclusive gig with PC Magazine by that time. And they just kind of looked the other way and said, yeah, we don't care. Do whatever you want to do. And so I really kind of was sort of like the bastard little brother around Ziff. And that's how I viewed it. The presumption was that if I ever sold to anybody, it would be to Ziff Davis. But in other conversations, they were afraid they'd just kill it if they did. And so it was kind of a coexistence there. But then, I mean, these guys were pretty blatant. They're just scared to death. They're scared you'll come after something they're doing. That kind of blew me away.
Yeah, Wayne Green did mention, apparently Wayne Green sold the same magazine to Ziff Davis twice because he sold it to them. They bought it, they ruined it. He bought it back for a fraction, built it up again, they bought it again from him, and then ruined it. So,
Kilobaud Microcomputing?
something like that, yeah.
Right.
The thing that's not known much is he only ran Byte for a very short time before he lost it in a divorce settlement.
Well, there was a conversation with, who was the editor of Byte when it went down? Byte magazine actually put me in the magazine business. I wrote a little document, a story about synchronizing your PC clock to the Naval Observatory. They had a modem set up, and you could actually capture a string and coordinate your PC clock to it. And I wrote a story about this and the whole development of the time zones and, keeper of the clock type thing, and sent it to Byte magazine and got a letter back from this guy that they just couldn't see any interest in such an article. And the next issue, they came out basically with my story, written by somebody else, it was on staff, and I was heroically offended. And that was kind of about the time I'm playing with this BBS list. And so in my mind, it was always to be Byte magazine. And then I ran into the guy the month they shut it down. Can't remember his name. Yeah. Early onset Alzheimer's.
Well, a lot of it is just because there's...
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, first ones were your impressions from BBS.com. You seem to get that. The other ones were why you started Boardwatch and to get some opinions from, the position of running Boardwatch. So we have that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it is just the thing is that with a lot of your story, it's not so much things. It's personality.
Mm-hmm.
It's just how much your personality had an effect on that early 90s BBS go-go period, when it really, it's almost like you're conducting the orchestra. They go faster and faster and faster, and they can't even keep up, and they're adding more instruments at the rate that they're going. You're like, you're just not playing fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
And it just crescendos, this unbelievable crescendo, and then as soon as it turns out that that with an internet connection, you will get multiple windows if you leave the modem on all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's when it breaks everything. It's like there being rock music, and it turns out there's a new form of music, but you can't listen to guitars and listen to this great new music. That kills rock music. It's just this amazing choice people make once they go with it's Winsock, basically. Once Winsock is here, we'll give you multiple windows on your machine. You can connect and do 4 things at once. But you can't disconnect and call the local board anymore, or you'll lose all your connection. And then people are that's the end of it. They're gone. And people are telling me, I've interviewed a lot of people who told me that the breaking point for them was when they were measuring the calls per week.
Mm-hmm.
They measured the calls per week, and they say, I'm down to 1 call a week.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I spending $35 for my phone line for this? Time with that computer. So, but it's just, I guess that's mostly what, you're the only one who knows what it's like from being the conductor side. The fact that Boardwatch was very successful in, pulling water from air, almost,
That would be an irony. I suppose that I'm the only one that didn't get it. There is that possibility. There was this huge division drawn by the participants between the internet and bulletin board systems. I was tone deaf to that. It looked like the same thing to me. Since, as I say, we covered the internet from 87 or 88, and bulletin boards from about the same time, I didn't realize how divided our audience was, our readership. And I really think the people that I had in mind as our readership, it wasn't. So that division between the dial-up over the telephone lines and the internet was dialed up over the I still don't quite get the division, right? And from my point of view, you have to understand that everyone that I knew personally that operated a bulletin board not became, but at the same time as they added capabilities, were internet service providers. I mean, that's the best I can explain why I'm a little tone deaf to this big division you're drawing here. And I have heard it before, by the way. I've had numerous times been just kind of wowed. Somebody say, "Man, did you make the transition?" What transition? We had the same name in the end that we started with. I mean, we did the same things. But Kevin Behrens, Aquila BBS, or Bob Mahoney, any of the BBS operators that I knew added internet capability as it became possible. And it simply evolved that way. All the internet service providers that we wrote for in the end were the same guys. In most cases, using much of the same equipment in the same rooms. So I never did see the break. In fact, I still have to reject the entire line of argument that there ever was one. It was names of things changed, and they evolved as they went along. I coined the term internet service provider. We made a lot of the words that you use up in my office. And sometimes discussed them and sometimes just naturally put a label on them. So when you draw a division based on a name, it's not terribly real to me, but the reality of being there, of the equipment and the people and the processes and the techniques, there was no division. The internet was an excellent development of it, primarily because it was a bypass of the meter on the long-distance telephone network. That was its main function. And we got higher data rates. We got higher data rates every year, by the way. And still do. I'm at 54 megabits now. It's great. It'll be better next year. And so, there was this continuous evolution. There were lots of tools and lots of things, from software programs to hardware to connectivity. But the people were largely the same ones in my world. And what they were trying to do was the same thing in my world. And I didn't see any, and still don't. I think this is a figment of public imagination. I was there. There wasn't. It was the same guys doing the same thing in the same way. And every year there were developments and new aha things. That's what we were about. That was our reason to live. And so the great divide between the bulletin boards, it was almost done in arrears. There were some people that came into bulletin boards late and bought a Mustang package off the shelf, plugged in a PC, and for a few $100s had a bulletin board system. The guys that started these, a single line bulletin board cost $5,000 or $6,000 to start. You had to cobble it together yourself, and it wouldn't run.
Vinton Cerf, when I interviewed him I interviewed him, by the way, because he appeared at the BBS con.
Several times.
So my theory was, what could it hurt? Maybe he'll say yes, and he did. But one statement of his that does persist is his statement. He was like, I never understood why people were freaked out by, BBS being on the internet. It's just another communications network.
Vinton Cerf and I are pretty much of one mind on this. And he was at the sort of the keynote speaker at BBS Con in 1992 or 3. The one at the Broadmoor Hotel.
He started subscribing afterwards after you invited him, which again, part of that prescience is the thing, is that weird analogy, but there's a hacker conference called H2K, which goes on in New York, and they invited the leader of this band to come speak. And the reason they invited the leader of a band to come speak was because he was a politically active guy. And he said, here's the things you need to be thinking about in all of your hacking. You need to think about. So what it was the guy who organized it, it was actually a very prescient move to bring in this guy from what would otherwise is supposed to just find the biggest hacker there was. Like, so your keynote speaker wasn't the guy who running the most successful BBS. It was this guy who had helped create the underlying forms of the internet to come in and say, here's something, this has happened before, this will happen again, and you need to understand it.
Yeah, the guys in the center of this were not caught unawares. Vinton Cerf did a whole thing on the internet protocol and how it worked and so forth at our second BBS con. Everyone who attended there heard him and paid attention. They were glued to the edge of their seat. This was before anybody knew that Vinton Cerf was the father of the internet. I kind of made that up later. And that's how he kind of got to be the father of the internet.
That's what it says on his page. It takes, by the way, as opposed, in case you're wondering, it took me a 2-month reserve to get him to get the hour, but I got the hour. He's just one of those guys. You gotta. And I was given an itinerary before the week before. I got the whole, and here's where to go. Here's how you meet him. Here's what you do. So the only person I interviewed who was like that.
He's a very gracious man.
He
is kind of organized.
Oh yeah.
And
he had something at 9. He had something at 11, and I was in the middle.
He was on our cover probably 3 times. I understand what you're saying because I've heard it before, but it's not true, and it's demonstrably not true. A lot of the guys that worked in these software companies were involved in the internet. The problem with the internet was that you couldn't get on it. The bulletin board guys are the ones that made it where you could. Tom Jennings, FidoNet, The Little Garden. Anybody that was anybody as an internet service provider had been a BBS guy. But I actually ran it. There was a stigma, almost. I actually ran into guys who didn't want it known that they had run bulletin boards because it wasn't politically correct in the new internet. So I'm aware it went on. I was just sort of tone deaf to it, but I know a little bit too much about it.
The one quote of yours that I actually mentioned to a few people is, this was a phone conversation, had to be from 2002. Was your bucket analogy for the tsunami, which was the one about everyone loves this one. This is the one where you said that, when you were informing people about the coming internet wave, that everyone ran down to the shore with their buckets ready to catch the wave.
Right.
Everyone loves that. That's one of your gifts, right? Is that, you give an analogy and it's right there. And for a lot of these people, it's...
Well, that was in response to the situation in the letters to the editor of, you're abandoning me, I'm a BBS operator. I'm like, look, you got to get a clue. Here's the thing. I keep publishing stuff in here. And you claim to be a reader. Well, here's the deal. I kind of feel like I'm telling people to get ready for this thing that's coming. And I'm describing a tsunami. And since it's 4 inches tall out in the Pacific, they've come down with buckets. It's going to wipe out, the beach.
If you had to define it, I mean, is there a kind of a BBS type or a CISOP type or that you ran into? The kind of person who would want to run a bulletin board?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. They were, essentially the classic, geek type person is pretty. They were generally people who were sufficiently bright that it was painful, and so they would adopt certain affectations, long hair, beards, something. They tended to relate to technology and computers better than they did to people. They had certain social skills that were a little rough around the edges. Now, there's exceptions to every rule, and there were people of all stripes, but the classic BBS guy was a little bit uneasy with anything but a computer, and they spent a lot of time with software, hardware, technology, and so forth. And in their space, that was considered somewhat eccentric, where if I could put them together, it was not. It was not only accepted but celebrated. And so in my mind, that was the classic, not so much BBS guy, but just a computer and technology type individual. And I could kind of pick them out of a crowd.
Was there looking back, and again, as I understand, your memory's fuzzy, but understandably, you moved on to other things, but is there a BBS that really sticks in your mind as just like a quintessential peak, or several of them, like, in my mind, there's one called The Safe House, Pirates of Cujo Sound, and Sheriff Forest. In my mind, when I think of a BBS, I go, well, that's what they were for. That's what it was about. And as Boardwatch, obviously you were clamoring to look at a lot, so you probably looked a lot more.
What was the question again?
Since you were at this, like, a lot of bulletin board systems presented themselves to you, and I would assume that even though you had to start doing a lot of writing, but for you, is there a bulletin board that really sticks in your mind as, like, really, it was a pleasure for you to log on to it?
Oh, I liked them all. There was something new and different on every one. I admired Bob Mahoney's Exec PC from a very early time. I can't remember their name. There was a couple up in Bryan and
Channel 1?
Channel 1 in Harvard. I actually went up there and saw their thing right off Harvard Square. Visited with Brian and I can't remember her name. And they had, quite an early success. The bulletin board got to be very large. The problem is, even the term bulletin board systems is sort of all-encompassing. It broke into a number of different things. There were bulletin boards that were primarily message bases, much like a news group or something is now, that were topical message areas that were echoed around the country. There were chat services that used, Galacticom or something like that were all interactive live chat. There were the file repositories after the fashion of Exec PC. And these would be like different niches. Even the pornography bulletin boards were like their own little world. So there were many different things. What you did with a bulletin board system was not particularly interesting to me, beyond that you could do it. This was the purpose, was to have a medium to do this type of at your convenience communication at a very low cost. And the bulletin boards, as run by a bulletin board operator, was essentially like a publication. They, by selection, presented files, message areas, screen designs, and so forth of their own making that made it an individual bulletin board system. So it was a fairly rich medium. It had some narrow bandwidth elements to it. You can't do the same in an email message that you can in a face-to-face conversation. But it was a fairly rich medium for these BBS operators to express themselves as the creator, as the publisher of the bulletin board system, much as a website is today. The tools were a little cruder because it was a little earlier, but essentially a bulletin board and a website there's very little distinction to draw there. Really.
Okay. Just kill the second tape. Are you up for a third tape, or do you want? I mean, what do you think?
It's entirely up to you, Jason. I can do a third tape if you can do a third tape, and would you want to do a third tape?
Yeah, I think I want to just dot and pepper around, fill in a few more gaps.
Okay.
A lot of with this documentary, there's different cross purposes happening, but one of them is just having some people, it makes people happy. Mm-hmm. Because I have a lot of people who will talk in excruciating detail about Fido, mm-hmm. but you have to have Tom Jennings in there with his opinion, which tends to be, Tom doesn't care about a particular controversy that happens in Net 104 in Maryland, and he wouldn't have any insight into it. And if you ask him about it, he'll go, well, like you have to say, which is like, well, Fido had a lot of people, and then, so drilling down into a lot of details doesn't benefit anybody, really. Mm-hmm. Except for the people who still harbor hatred because, whatever, the sponge BBS didn't give them their feed when they wanted it. Mm-hmm. So, much like that, there are controversies that exist from, Boardwatch and BBS Con and this and that. And a lot of it just, I find, tends to be like a clash of personalities. So I'm interviewing people of that type. Mm-hmm. But having your insight, because you did, like you said, spend about 12 years doing it. Boardwatch just stopped being a paper publication last year.
Yes, I was aware of that.
Okay. So one of the guys who I interviewed in Seal Rock, Oregon, had a copy of it. He was like, "This is the last print one." I was like, "Really?" I was like, "Wow."
It took them 4 or 5 years, but they did finally drill it into the ground.
Yeah, that's pretty much. Well, that's. They're now a website, I think. I'm under the impression it's going to be a website. It's going to be a web publication.
Yeah, right.
A web publication, that's kind of like a home-based business that you run while you have a full-day job.
Kind of the last step before you disappear completely.
Yeah, well,
that's where print publications go and they die.
One of the things that does happen in the early 90s, a lot of it does happen in the early 90s, it seems, is the government really started to take an interest in PBS as a force entity, legislatable entity, concern, and everything else. That's when you start seeing high-profile PBS busts. That's when you start to see laws being passed that are trying to include PBSs in as things that need to be watched. You start seeing a lot of that. Taxes, there's always that eternal tax concern that happens. Like, are they going to start taxing my bulletin board for getting lines? Did you have any thoughts about that at that time? That do you think things were heading in a certain direction before the internet got their attention?
There's a lot in that question. The basics. any type of egalitarian, individually empowering technologies tend to diminish the power of centralized organizations. To some degree, bulletin boards, the internet, and such basically many-to-many mediums of communication are inherently disempowering to a centralized government or a telephone company or large companies in one respect. And so I think there was some legitimate fear or consternation among people in the government about bulletin boards and the internet, and there is yet today. That said, it was not nearly to the level that people in the BBS community thought it was. There was kind of a raging paranoia that they're going to come shut us down and they're going to, arrest us and so on and so forth. Most of the visible arrests or confrontations between government and bulletin board systems had two aspects that I don't think the people in the community understood. One, they were largely driven by complaints from people within the community that demanded that the government do something. One bulletin board operator competing with another one, and he thought this one was doing too well because he had too much porn, and so he'd call him, man, something be done, and did they know that this guy was doing this? In the actual governmental office, there's this guy listening to all this, and he has no idea what this fellow's talking about. But it sounds alarming. And normally there was a lot of looking into and learning curve from people in the government and large corporations and so forth. That occasionally did break into the sort of prima donna prosecutor who wanted to be in the newspaper and to be perceived as very technically adroit and knowledgeable. So it was kind of a fashion show more than any kind of a crackdown or any type of organized attack on these media. In fact, the people within government, like the people without government, are break into various camps depending on what they know about these things. So the actual position of government on bulletin boards or the internet is magnified in the minds of the people who know it best, which are the ones that are using it, not the people in the government. They're largely, if you had to characterize them, agnostic, confused, and not terribly concerned. Because it's not a real visible thing on their radar screen. The worst thing you can tell someone who is passionate about what they do is that no one cares. And so this is a very difficult message for me to deliver to bulletin board operators that, by and large, most of the people in the government don't know you exist and wouldn't care if you did. So there was some paranoia beyond what was there. There was some fashion show of we need to, at one time, prosecute a few of these people as examples, and then that should quiet it down among very widely scattered individuals in law enforcement. By far the majority of it was just some local sheriff looking for a newspaper article. So I didn't take it too seriously. The more important work then and now is this will change the relationship of individuals to more centralized organizations. And how do we deal with things like freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And so I kind of had common ground with Mitch Kapoor and John Perry Barlow and Electronic Freedom Foundation in doing that. But largely our role was to educate people from the government or from telephone companies, for that matter. I found that the more they knew and understood about things, the less of a threat they were. Yeah, I think so. Would you like one? Phil, what's his name, did that PKP program, pretty good privacy, PGP.
Phil Zimmerman. Yeah, Phil Zimmerman.
Yeah, and things like that, they think they have to deal with this somehow, that they have a right to, listen in on our communications and decode them and so forth. And it's not something they can keep up with. I was fairly relaxed in that I knew they couldn't. Some of it's just a quantity function, and even the pornography issue or any of it, it's not particularly a part of the online thing that I'm close to, but it's a medium that you can do with what you want, and if people want to do most anything, I'm not generally opposed. I'm not quite to the anarchic level, but I'm pretty deep into the libertarian level. And so anything that empowers that is a good thing. If the government has a little problem with it, that's got its own entertainment value. But I was never concerned about the government shutting it down. I'm not concerned about them taxing the internet now. But they can do various things more generally on expression and so forth. Anytime, and again, it's always at the request of someone in the community. Right now, you have this thing with spam, and people are demanding that the government do something about it. That's why they want to do something about it. They don't even understand it, but people keep contacting them, demanding that something be done, and so they have to start investigating it in a sense of finding out what it is and how it works to be able to do that.
I guess I could ask about the third Phil Cass. Did you pay much attention to the ARC, the PK ARC, PK Zip ARC battle that happened?
I was kind of around for that. Yeah, we covered it.
Did you have an impression of it?
Well, it was kind of complicated. I'm not sure I recall all of it. It got down to Tom Henderson releasing the source code of his ARC so people could do things with it. And he was very reluctant to do that. I kind of knew why. Nobody else did. I had a conversation with him on the phone, and he didn't admit it, but it led me to believe that he wasn't too sure how it worked, and it wasn't in very good shape for review. Kind of a bunch of spaghetti code that did what it did, and he had theories about how it worked. But so he was very upset. I mean, this was a classic case of somebody that came up with something in the basement, and suddenly he was doing a couple $100,000 a year doing this. And then it got taken away by the next innovation in the field. And so it was kind of hard for him. There were lots of threats of legal action between the various parties. I think Tom probably threatened to sue Phil or something. And so it was a controversial thing, but it was a very brief period before it had sort of sorted itself out because Zip was better.
I'm interviewing Bob Mahoney is going to help give me Phil's side because I don't have Phil to give me his side. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to be interviewing Tom Henderson, who very explicitly has his own side on it. It's actually an extremely complicated picture, and Tom Henderson was right. That's the weird thing. But they were so bad in getting their case out.
Oh, yes, it was.
So, I mean, that's the thing.
And that recurring theme. Brilliant minds that just can't function in some venues.
Yeah.
It's.
And when they told, it's one thing to say you stole our code and put it out,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of true, kind of. I mean, PKArch was ARC rewritten in assembly, basically. So it ran faster, it did things faster, but it functionally was the same as there. And Phil Katz had done consulting for SEA, for Tom Henderson's company. But then, so they're kind of right, and they're suing him. But then they said, and one of the reasons we're suing you is because we own the ARC extension.
Yes.
That was the single stupidest move of all their actions, because now the entire community is like, you own what?
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean you own what? And suddenly SEA is being portrayed as this huge company that's trying to quash Phil Katz. And as it's been explained to me, Phil Katz's company was 5 people, and SEA was 3 people.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, it's a really amazing thing how that perception just.
Yeah.
And it was, and it's one of those tempest in a teapot things. This fight.
Well, you can go on about that forever. The problem is, and they may have done some work for them, and that doesn't preclude their ever doing a similar product. The protectable investment there is the code, and it wasn't even in the same language. So it's not stolen. The concept of compressing files was not really protectable. It had been done before, and most of the techniques used by both products were not invented by either. Huffman coding was around a long time. These were compression techniques that had been published for years. So it got down to there really wasn't much protectable there other than the ARC extension. The problem was a lot of software and so forth, particularly in FidoNet, depended on that extension. And the reason it was controversial was not files that you could download and do, but mail packets that were compressed and sent around the network. And who would unzip or unarc what? It actually fractured the ability to do mail between systems, because this one was using zip and this one was using arc. And so it was fairly easy to write something that would shell it to the appropriate program, but to recognize the file at all, they were using the ARC extension. And so Tom seized on that as the protectable asset, which he had made up, ARC, and it could have been anything. And so it actually wasn't crazy what he did. The problem was that he had a competitor who'd written a program where he'd had none before, and he really didn't have anything that was protectable. It certainly wasn't stolen source code because it was in another language. And in fact, it didn't really do them the same way. It did parts of it in the same way. This goes through kind of an analysis of the file to determine which of several compression techniques works the best. And zip worked better, and it was written in assembly language, and it won. And that was that. But it was fascinating to watch it play out in the community and the way they handled it. And Tom did pretty much butcher the public relations end of it.
Let's see. What finally made you decide it was time to sell?
I would say there were several factors. Some of them internal. We had gotten to 22 employees. It was an awful lot of people to keep up with. I don't really, my main talent isn't managing people and employees, and it's not one of my favorite things to do, but it had become a good part of what I did. And so that was, the housekeeping had become increasingly onerous and unpleasant, and ate up a good bit of time. I would say the biggest driver was the sense that we were growing so fast that we couldn't survive it. We couldn't function. I had 22 people. I needed 35, and I had no one that had time to take a new employee and write down their Social Security number. We didn't have time to talk to them. We didn't have time to interview them, and we needed them right now. It was fairly explosive growth in '98. We went to 2 shows. The shows were overwhelming successes, and I mean, like, they went from 2,000 or 3,000 people to 8,000 or 10,000 people at the next show. We were selling out of space. We didn't have any place to put vendors. We couldn't do the registration properly. We couldn't do, and so we were starting to fail in execution. The actual genesis of the sale was I went to buy Media. They had 160 people and did some big shows. And I called Alan and said, I need all your stuff. You lost, we won. We got all the vendors, we got the show, we got the magazine. And it's over. I need your stuff. I need your copier machines, I need your people, I need your buildings, I need all of it. What's your number? And he laughed and said, we're publicly traded. It would be, X amount of dollars. Well, choice, what's your number, and I'll buy you. And he likes running companies, and so he said, well, it'd be better if I bought you. You're private, and I'm publicly traded. I said, well, however we do it, I got to have all your stuff. And we had all the business, and they had all, and they were bloated with employees, and so it turns out horribly inefficient, and it really wasn't that good a marriage. But I was somewhat desperate. We couldn't hardly get through the day. We were going 800 miles an hour with our hair on fire. I had 22 people. We're all working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was just, something was going to snap. And I couldn't grow my way out of it organically. And this is a very common problem in technology. You just push and push and push. You can't get it to grow, and then all of a sudden it takes off without you. And suddenly we don't have enough people to answer the phones. We don't have enough people to do anything. We're trying to get the next issue out. There's tons of emergencies about the next show. There's vendors calling all day long. I mean, with, huge $100,000, $200,000 contracts to do this, that, and the other. And they want somebody to talk to them about it. And how's it going to go? What do they need to do? And, I'm out of people. So that was the immediate problem at the time of sale. And we were starting to execute poorly because of that stress and simply being swamped. And I don't like to execute poorly. We did everything at Boardwatch and at those shows was fairly paramilitary. They just happened the way I wanted them and when I wanted them, and that was how we did business. And suddenly, that was starting to break down. So those were some of the thoughts along the way. In the overall picture, what am I doing here? I'm talking to lawyers, I'm talking to employees, I'm not playing with technology, I'm not interviewing people, I'm not writing stories, I'm down to doing the editor's notes and the letters to the editor, and beyond that, I don't get to do any of the fun stuff anymore. I get to run Boardwatch, and suddenly the industry was changing. Here we were swamped with money people and people wanting to talk about roll-ups, and we're going to We want you to help us select the 20 best ISPs in the northern Midwest region for a roll-up, and we're going to, spend $80 million on this, that, or the other. And none of that was anything that I was interested in. So literally, I looked at it. It was built. The townies had moved in, and the growth that we had internally was such that it wasn't fun for me to do anymore. And so I decided not to do it. Sold the company. I had kind of an open-ended thing with them. I stayed for a few months. We then did kind of a sale of Meckler Media to Penton Media, and the guy with Penton and the guy with Meckler did a little side deal that sort of defrauded the rest of the shareholders, and I wouldn't play. And told them I believe that I couldn't let my mommy see me playing with you kids. I know how this goes. And so I resigned from the company, and that was about 6 months. I sold in May, sold to Penton in October, November, and I was done there. So it was a pretty clean break, and if I had it to do over again, I'd probably do it the same way. We were just up against the wall, changing industry, changing situation, and not any of the parts I had come for. So it was a different thing.
Did you want to talk to your son? Did he need something that was needed something, or do you think he was just like, "What's up with Dad today"?
Probably the latter.
Okay. A natural question. You answered this to me over the phone, but not on the camera. Was why we didn't just see another Jack Rickard publication?
Well, that's an interesting question. I had sold these guys the company. I actually didn't have a very strong non-compete. I could have pretty much done anything I wanted to. But the computer industry is fairly small, and so I wanted to kind of give them a clear road without interference from me for a while. And along the way after that, I just didn't ever latch on to anything I really wanted to do the way I had that online gig. So I went off and found something as different as I could that would occupy a similar amount of energy and obsession, and that was primarily aviation. I learned to fly and had 10 airplanes, and I play with airplanes all day, that sort of thing. But there's probably not a week goes by that I'm not mulling another magazine, and I've kind of got a deal working today to buy a whole magazine house with 10 titles. I don't know if we'll complete that or not, but eventually I'll be back in publishing.
Okay. When we last talked to you, the one that really strikes me is David Ahl, who did creative computing, and now he has a little magazine that's like about military hardware, and he really splits himself off. I mean, he finally wrote something. Somebody finally, one of the little geek sites, like something that would be run by me, finally like tracked him down. It was like, so what's the deal? Why is there a new creative computing that was the greatest magazine ever? And he won't go into that. He's just like, look, I just do military hardware now, things like that. Leave me alone.
Well, there is an aspect. Once you've done something and have done it successfully, and actually the sale of Boardwatch for what it was, the size it was, the amount it sold for, and so forth, it's kind of a phenomenon in the magazine business. Probably part of the internet bubble hysteria to some degree. what would be the point in doing it again? You already kind of know how it's going to come out. So, so I can see why he would do something like that. It would be more appropriate to go do something new, and do it somewhat differently, drawing from what you learned. But to go do the same thing again, these wireless ISP guys want me to go do that. Well, it's actually kind of fascinating. I'm intrigued by them and the technology and so forth. But as far as me personally, it would be, so okay, all I have to do is go crawl through piss, blood, and razor blades on my hands and knees for 12 years, 16 hours a day, and I know how this is going to come out. But I already did that. So I would be more drawn to something somewhat different. A different challenge or a different venue, certainly. But as far as, once you've been in publishing, all other businesses look stupid. It's a great gig.
That's what I stayed in the game industry for a while. I was a video game maker, kind of. And I was in a startup that died, and people were like, why didn't you stay with that? And I was like, because the video game industry looked at the Hollywood industry and how they screwed over people and said, we have the technology to optimize that process. Mm-hmm. And so they were like, for every bad thing the Hollywood system treats people, the game system found a way to increase that because they're not unionized even. Mm-hmm. So they don't even have to have that problem. They hire guys in and then they'll hire a guy to make a game and then they will literally fire them and hire in 5 cheaper guys to make a bad version of the same game name and put it out on people enough to make money. Mm-hmm. And then just enough to get themselves bought out by another one. Mm-hmm. It's just horrible. Anyway, so I moved up to computers. But in terms of, let me think. Trying to think of some of the relevant things. I mean, there's some stuff where it's just like, so what? Jack, I asked Ward Christensen about something, and Ward said, I don't even think there's a point answering that because I have a belief that you shouldn't ask people who are good at something their opinion on something else, assuming that their talent translates to that field as well. Uh-huh. So he's like, don't ask me about politics. I'm good with, technology, but, if you say, so what does the X-Motive guy think about, this current censorware trend or whatever? It's like, I'm just going to make stuff up as much as the next guy. There's no reason you shouldn't be trading in on that thing. So I'm trying to think of stuff that's specific to asking you. I mean, with Boardwatch, there are other BBS magazines that come and go a little. I mean, I have copies of BBS magazine, and I have copies of a few other little things. Mm-hmm. And they are, not that I'm showing my bias or anything, but they really seem to be templated Me Too's. Mm-hmm. Did you have any perception of them for that much at the time? Did you pick up copies and check them?
Oh, yeah. Sure, we looked at anything that, in fact, we looked at anything that talked about computers and communications at all. I'm not intimately, I can't give you the list of all the people that said, hey, that looks like a pretty good gig. We'll do one just like that, and how people won't be able to tell, But it's, I'm a very competitive person, but not usually in the sense that other people are. In other words, in my world, there's 260 million people in the country. I could rent all cable channels on all cable systems and put a continuous ad for Boardwatch magazine on 24 hours a day for 6 weeks. There was no TV in the United States except about Boardwatch magazine. When the final clip would run, You could walk out on the street, and somebody standing there would say, "Well, what the hell's the Boardwatch magazine?" You know, the part that I could come to grips with as a publisher that most publishers can't is most people don't know you exist, and of those that do, most of them don't care. And of those that care, most of them don't have time to read it. And so you get into progressively smaller spheres of influence. The only way you can counteract that is, to some degree, to compete with agnosticism, this desultory ennui that no one really cares, but it's not a very active thing. You have to make them care. And what drove us systemically was a philosophy that if we would do the next issue of Boardwatch magazine 1% better than the last one, and we would do the one after that 1% better than that one, after a certain serial number of issues, we win. And that was the philosophy, and it worked very well. Now, in a world of 260 million people, most of whom don't care, somebody else introduces another magazine, and the next month runs all our articles again, rewritten. What? You know. I suppose in an advertising sales sense, it's competitive, but I never had much to do with that. I hired guys and told them answer the phone, and if they want to advertise, get their money, you know. So it wasn't something I had to worry about. So I was very competitive in that each issue had to be better than the last, and that, you know, most of the world didn't care, and it was kind of like a privilege to get an hour of somebody's month and their attention. I would rather be abused than ignored. I'd rather have them complain about me than not know about me. I'd rather have them hate me than ignore me. And that was the competitive nature of it. Other magazines, other computer magazines and stuff, occasionally they call, "Why do you put your whole magazine up on the web for free? How can you do that?" And I'd tell them and explain it to them. You know, anything about our operation, there weren't any secrets, there wasn't anything I didn't want to talk about. I'd tell anybody anything. They would go away not knowing if I'd told them the truth or not knowing if it was a trick. And mostly not knowing because of their own sort of problems with deception and competitive juices and so forth. And I had all those things, but it was aimed at different things. And so another magazine they never were a competitor to me. And to some degree, that made it to where they couldn't compete with me. They were trying to compete with me instead of what the real competition was and what drove the market. If I get to define the game, you lose.
At the BBS cons, like we discussed before, the Jack and Phil show really got a lot of interest in it. And you spoke in other aspects as well, although I don't think as much as Phil did. Phil seems to really appear quite a bit on a lot of different, sometimes it looks like he's in concurrent sessions. I wonder if he just stayed in the same room and waited for the second group. But, that puts you in the position of going from being, a writer to being a public and or a motivational speaker to this group of people. Do you think that adds to your mystique, or do you think it magazine, to be able to come back from the magazine and having spoken to a crowd of people. Because you have a distinct speaking style equivalent to a distinct writing style. I've heard the tapes.
What happened, actually didn't like speaking in public. There is a perception, and this is pretty much across journalism, I think, that if you can write cogently, you must be a good speaker. And actually, it's not so, and they don't really translate very well. In fact, the first BBS Con, or the last FidoCon we were at, I actually wrote something and tried to read it to these people, and it was horrible. And I finally took it and threw it away in the middle of it and just talked to them a little bit, and that worked a little better. I had to learn to speak in public, and it's not only a skill I didn't have, it's one I didn't particularly value. I didn't really want it to do these shows. Phil likes to be on stage, and he was to be there. One of the ironies of that whole thing was, as we did it show after show, I became more central a figure, and he less so, when that wasn't the plan or either one of our desires. But I learned valuable lessons from that. I didn't actually speak that much. People think I did. I mostly introduced other people who spoke. And I would tell a little bit about them and what they'd done and how they did it and so on and so forth. And introduce them, and then they would speak. And that's mostly what I did at BBSCon, is walk around and introduce other people. And I learned one of the most fascinating things that I got out of those shows. The harder you try to shine the limelight or the attention on other people, the more it's drawn to you. Whether you want it to or not, whether that's your purpose or not. The more you try to cast it, the more it centers. And I guess I still don't understand it, but I know it to be so. And so there was kind of a mythology that it wasn't in my commercial interest to dispel, that I could speak in public and have these sessions and so forth. Truthfully, I presented very few sessions. Didn't enjoy doing it then, and in fact, an oddity of showdom is, people learn in different ways. One of the successes of our shows was these classrooms. You can't go to a university and learn this stuff. It's being developed real time. And a lot of people want to sit in a classroom and have it presented to them. Actually, I'm not one of them. I have to get it out of a book. If I want to know something, I want to know about digital photography or something, I go get 7 books, spread them all out on the floor, and kind of read all 7 of them at the same time. And I check if this guy's got it right, because these other 2 agree with him. And that's I can do this amazingly rapidly. Sitting in a room listening to somebody talk is too slow, and I can't do it. I couldn't sit through a session at my own show, and I'm kind of the one that invented this 250 sessions. But a lot of people, that's how they like to learn, and we just learn to feed that. But
Just for a moment. Next. It is on. It is recording. Also, I don't always look at you because I'm taking pictures and I'm the whole crew.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, when I told you about this whole project and stuff, was there anything that came to the front of your mind that you wanted people to know about, or was there anything, I always ask people that so that, sometimes people are like, oh, well, if you're going to put this on tape, you got to know about this, or you have to do this. Is there anything like that?
No, not really.
Okay.
I don't really have much of an agenda here, Jason. This is your magazine.
Well, now, when did you first become aware that there are these things called BBSs?
I would say 1982, 83. I was in St. Louis and had pieced together a little Sinclair ZX80 computer kit and built a modem for it out of piece parts, and was kind of running a DEC 20 at Emerson Electric from home. And somebody gave me a list of 5 or 6 bulletin boards that were operating then. And I started dialing those just to check whether the modem worked or not with different other modems. So early 80s, 82, 83.
And, I mean, you'll find we skip around. I'm not really going too linear.
Mm-hmm.
You'd mentioned on the phone to me about BoardWatch. I mean, it's one thing to be running BBSs on and off, but it's another to decide to make a publication about them. And how did that come about?
How did that come about? I was out in Denver several years later, and the bulletin board thing, which, I really think sort of St. Louis was the early genesis of a lot of the popularity of it. But I'd moved out to Denver, and it kind of spread out there, and they had some bulletin boards. I wrote technical documentation for defense contractors and was doing some work with one remotely by modem, and someone handed me a list of bulletin board systems. I started dialing the bulletin board systems with an old Anderson Jacobson modem that put the phone in the cradle, and it was badly obsolete at that time, even then. So you dial the number and put this phone in the cradle, but about probably 60% of this printed list of bulletin boards was, they weren't there. And people would answer the phone. As it turns out, the telephone company, the bulletin boards were up and down in those days. Most of the bulletin boards only worked in evening hours. This was somebody's daytime phone during the day. And they'd do it for a while, sometimes a week or two, or sometimes a month or two, and then quit doing it. And a lot of times they'd give the phone line back to the phone company. It'd be reassigned to some other hapless yuck who moved into town, and they're getting 10 or 12 calls an evening from these people with this list of bulletin board systems. The problem kind of captured my attention since I had the handset there. I would talk to them when it didn't connect. When someone would answer, I could hear them, and I'd pick up the handset and talk to them. And came across some amazing stories. This one woman just burst into tears. She was nearly hysterical. And I thought I'd somehow really offended her, and I apologized for calling and so on and so forth. She said no, she was delighted to know what it was. She was getting 10 or 12 calls an evening, and what people, even in those days, and certainly today, don't realize is the calling modem doesn't really make a tone. There's nothing to tell you that someone's calling. The phone answers, you answer the phone, and there's dead silence on the other end. It's the answering phone by that time. The convention was the answering telephone initiated the tone. So she thought she was being stalked by someone who was calling 10 or 12 times, typically at night between 9 o'clock and 2 in the morning, which is when all this went on. And that she was relieved to know there was a reason for this, and it wasn't someone targeting her. And I explained to her how it worked and so forth. And but going through this list, there were a lot of victims of this bulletin board list. It would just never die. It was on bulletin boards. You could download it and print it out. It was never updated. It had been done by somebody and just left there. And and it was down to about a third of the bulletin boards on the list. It might have been 30 bulletin boards. Were actually bulletin boards. This one woman wanted to know where the head computer was, that was causing all. And wanted me to shut it off. I go, lady, I don't have anything to do with it. I've got this list. I didn't even download it. Somebody handed it to me. And I don't know what to tell you. She just kept on, chewed me out up one side down the other, and insisted that I tell her where the main computer was. I just had a billing dispute with the utility company, so I finally told her that it was UE, the electric utility. It was their computer. That's where the problem was, and she had to go talk to them and get it all straightened out. So I can't imagine what came from that. So I took the list, dialed through it, found which bulletin boards were active, and crossed the other ones off. And along the way, I would get on the bulletin boards that were active and find messages posting other bulletin boards. The way advertising a bulletin board in those days was to post messages that you had one up and what the hours were and what the modem speed was and so on and so forth. So I started putting this all together. I was amazed to find there was about 160 bulletin boards actually operating in the Denver area. So I created this list and verified all the numbers and put it out there, and immediately realized I'd done the same thing. Now, as it aged, the same problem would be, and it did kill off the earlier lists and solve the problem for a couple dozen people. But immediately I put this thing out there, and it, on upload, immediately a couple of bulletin boards pulled the plug, and so we've got an aging list that starts aging at its completion. So I put it together in a little publication. I wouldn't upload it to bulletin boards anymore, but you could have this newsletter that had the list, and I put the list out every month, but only in paper format. So you couldn't upload it unless you wanted to type in 160 numbers, and none of them were that aggressive. And started adding little things about how X modem really worked and how to use it to download files and file compression, ARC, and later zip, and how they worked and how you used them and so forth. And people kind of took off with it. I mailed out 100 of them to just people's names and addresses I got from bulletin boards, and got 9 subscriptions the first month at $28. And so I had enough money to do it again the next month. And that's how it started.
Like you said, Boardwatch starts out somewhat technical in nature. I mean, here's the numbers, here's some computer ideas. At some point, it actually kind of grows into a more, I don't know if political is the word, but it's certainly a more social approach, more about here's where things are going, and you need to know about this, and you add columnists who give, in some cases, futurist opinion pieces and so on, where there's, did that come from anywhere? Did that trend start happening with you?
Well, understand I did about 135 issues at Boardwatch. So the interesting thing about a magazine is it gets to be it's a little bit organic. It changes a little bit each month. It started as like 16 pages, finest xerography available, and at the time I sold the company, we were 168 pages, 4-color monthly. Did 4 directories a year. Technical information, in conveying it, there's 2 approaches. One of them strives for efficiency, the maximum amount of information per unit volume. And we did that in a strange way. In those days, computers were viewed as primarily useful for 3 functions: word processing, spreadsheets, and databases. I kind of seized on a fourth function and found kind of a mentor in this in John Dvorak, who then was a columnist for InfoWorld, later PC Magazine. I thought they were for communications with these modems, but a computer just became much more useful when you exchanged body fluids with another computer. As part of the read, what we would do was take everything mentioned anywhere about using a computer and a modem and condense it. It was sort of a Reader's Digest of, this magazine would have 2 little bits about this, and this one would have a couple of bits about that, buried in all the talk about spreadsheets and databases and so forth. I mean, at the time, there was 50,000 people online worldwide. It was truly a marginal application of the personal computer. So we just pull it all together and actually shorten it. So BoardWatch had lots of little bits, just little sort of mini paragraphs. Magazines per se exist to sell advertising. And they're reluctant, even in doing a story about a product, or they were in those days. We actually sort of changed this mold. It was considered heresy in publication to mention the address or the contact name for a product that you were talking about in the magazine, because that was giving them free advertising. If they want to do that, they should buy a page. Well, we started out, we didn't sell advertising initially. It was entirely reader supported. So I had all these little blurbs that were had the contact information where you go to get more of the story. This is just a paragraph that this company has done this thing, and it's kind of interesting. And here's, their phone and fax and mailing address and so forth. We didn't have a World Wide Web at the time. A BBS number if they had it, And so that improved the read because it became a condensation. Take a whole lot of information, put it all together, but boil down. And it becomes an interesting read because you get 2 or 3 items you're not interested in, but then the 4th one you are. And so that technique worked very well. The other problem in conveying technical information, like descriptions of X modem or Z modem, or how ARC compression works, or how constellations and encoding of symbology works to increase data rates. And I was really quite good at this. I had a technical background and could write well, and in fact was a technical writer for some of the largest defense contractors in the world, and was one of the top technical writers in that field. There were certain restrictions on that, particularly in DoD, and how you can do it. In BoardWatch, I could do it any way I wanted to. If I tell you that this wireless 802.11g item that I'm looking at right now will do a 54 megabit data rate, that's sort of a dry kernel of information. If I tell you how it did it, it can be very dry. If I adopt a position on whether it should do it at all, it's a little bit easier to convey in a entertaining fashion, one that you'll remember. And if I describe to you the politics of how they came to that encoding scheme and who the guy is that did this and why he was almost knifed by his own employer because that wasn't really the politic thing to do at the time, then it becomes a story. And you'll learn a whole lot about 802.11g as a unlicensed band data medium. But what will cause you to read it is my opinion on it and a story about a person. And so very early on in BoardWatch, we developed a theory that a number of things. One of them is that computers should be used for communication, not just word processing, database. But the other one is all stories are people stories, which is essentially what you told me sitting down for this interview that you'd found in doing that. It's not just about bulletin boards, it's about people. And we found that very early on, too. Every innovation had people behind it. And the people stories were more interesting in some ways than the innovation. But it certainly made the innovation easier to understand and more memorable. It would stay with you when you knew the whole story of how it came about and why they did that and, that sort of thing. So I basically started a publication on pieces of paper done at home and photocopied and learned to do the magazine business and the writing of it from scratch. And along the way, to make it interesting, I had to develop some of these theories, and it was a marvelous laboratory because I got to put it out that month and see what the reaction was. And in a small community like bulletin boards and with the electronic feedback, I knew pretty quickly what worked and what didn't. So we developed opinions almost as a necessary part of conveying technical innovations, and to further make them interesting, we told the story of the people behind them. And you could read Boardwatch for a long time and not pick up on this. It felt like you were reading technical information because it got we didn't do puff pieces and press releases and so forth. If we were going to do a story on X Modem, you could write your own when you got done reading it. We did a description of how to configure Microsoft Windows with Trumpet to get on the internet that we probably sold 100,000 copies of that magazine over the next year to internet service providers that would give them to their customers. So to get them to through the process, which then was very icky. It wasn't like XP today that you're automatically on. You had to go through a series of totally nonsense things to get it to work at all. So that's the type of story we tackled. But along the way, being opinionated was almost a professional gig. If I didn't have an opinion about it, it didn't cause any reaction in me and probably wasn't important and no one would be interested in it. And if it did, I'd go ahead and put it in there. There was no pretense at editorial objectivity. It was, this guy's developed this and it's a stupid thing and it shouldn't be done and he won't last 6 months. And on the other hand, here's a guy that's done something that is truly an innovation, and he's getting, mauled by the large companies or the other powers that be, and somebody ought to take a look at this. This is not bad stuff. And so we did a lot of looking at things and those types of innovations, and we're fairly unapologetic about the opinionated nature of it. It was originally to make it interesting to read, but ultimately it kind of got to be the heart and soul of the publication.
When I speak to people about it, who are regular subscribers to Boardwatch, they, to a person, pretty much, talk about your personality. A lot of it ends up being that Boardwatch is you. Outside of the staff and how things are well done, these things are covered, you end up with a lot of people who that they bought it to hear what you had to say that month about a bunch of things, because the letters column would sometimes feel like it was half the magazine, with people.
And the letters column was kind of an interesting gig. I didn't read letters columns in other magazines. It was like part of the front matter you skipped through. And the idea of having a letters to the editor thing in Boardwatch, I thought was absurd. These people all discuss things every day in their electronic forums, various message areas and topical things. They could get in a battle royale and have 4 or 5 messages go back and forth in 5 minutes. We published monthly. We first had to knock down a tree, kill it, crush it, turn it into paper and smear it with ink, and then mail it to somebody, street mail. So how would this work? Jim Dunmeyer, kind of an Amish fellow who ran a bulletin board system out of a barn in Ohio, insisted basically that I added letters to the editor section. And he kept sending me letters that he wanted me to publish in the magazine. And so we had a kind of a spare page as the mathematics of paper work out. And so I stuck his letter in there and a response of why I thought it was a goofy idea to have a letters to the editor section, but now he has one. The reaction was that over the next few weeks after that came out, we got a whole slew of letters to the editor wanting to be in it too. Well, I didn't know. I truly didn't know that in the letters to the editor section, the editor didn't write back. I'd never looked at one in my life. So this is like a pretty big increase in the workload here. Now I've got this letter. I've got to get it in the thing electronically. And it might be scrawled on the inside of a milk carton. And then I've got to, come up with some reply. And, it's most famous for the opinions and so forth, but we actually put a lot of effort in that. There were a lot of people, constantly new people coming in contact with this and other things that wanted to know something technical that no one had ever brought up before. And we'd look at it, why does he want to know this? And, well, maybe other people want to, too. And so we'd have to go chase down this company and find out, how this worked or why they developed it this way or whatever it was. And I'd put a whole explanation of it in there. Well, as it turned out, that was informative to a certain segment of our readership. So there were a lot of basically quick articles, quick and dirty articles with no graphics. That, hey, how do you do this, or where can I find more about this, or what are the rules on this? How do I get my domain name registered? Some. And we'd go find it out, boil it down, and we didn't have to do graphics. We didn't have to do a page on it. We'd do a paragraph. Here's the answer to your question. And so that had some value there. Some of the letters were simply opinion and complaint. Generally, if I had a long letter, I gave it a short answer. If I had a short letter, I'd give it a long answer. And that it kind of worked out that way. So oddly, it not only caught on among our readership. In the end, we had 300 or 400 subscribers, people that didn't have computers and didn't understand what the rest of the magazine was about, nor did they care. They just wanted to read the letters to the editor. So it was, it got to be a big gig at Boardwatch, and quite a time-consuming one for me personally. But I enjoyed doing it, and the reaction was always pretty good.
One of the interesting side effects of once Boardwatch becomes, I guess the best adjective is powerful, at least a force within, the real sense I've gotten is that you and or Phil working with you bootstrap the concept of a BBS industry, where before, people sold it much like somebody might make crocheted napkins and sell them. But, you're like, no, there's a bunch of you, you're in competition with each other, you have features, there are things that should be expected of all of you to produce in your software and so on. That there's this, that it changes the nature of it. And suddenly there's now a cast of characters. There's PC Board and eSoft and Mustang and Galacticom, all doing that. I mean, did you have any? I mean, I don't know how much of that was logical to you, or how much of that just started to happen.
It was pretty much by design, and I could do the same thing right now. You're doing a documentary, and you've got a real nice video camera, and you're going around interviewing people. And you're the third person I've talked to this week that's doing that. Now, the other two weren't doing anything about bulletin boards or about me personally. But generally, we are not as unique as we think we are. And one of the greatest assets I had all along was a visceral understanding of that. If it was something that I was interested in that day, a technical thing with a printer, a modem, whatever it was, I could picture myself standing there looking at it and 2,500 or 3,000 other guys across the country doing it at the same time. But they don't know about each other. Most of the people that are doing these documentaries understand that Ken Burns does documentaries and that there are other people that do it, and they want to do it. They would be surprised to learn that there's, I would guess right now, 100,000 people in the country going around doing documentaries. They have to invent everything for themselves because they don't, sort of by trial and error. If I could hold up a mirror and say, here is you guys. Look here. This is what you're doing. And you're, number one, validated. You're not alone. There's other people doing it, and there's good reasons to be doing it. And two, this guy over here is doing it this way, and he's found something that's kind of remarkable. If you'll turn the camera around backwards, you'll be on the show too. Or something like that. And so Boardwatch tried to be, and it's not, you're not able to do this perfectly because of your own personal biases and so forth, a flat mirror showing the people who were trying to do this and understand it was such a small number of people. It was very expensive to do. The bulletin boards later on were kind of plug and play. These guys had to invent this. They had to write their own software to do it in most cases. Gradually, there were like little guys who did better hacks than other ones. And companies, they were in their basement, sharing this with somebody else and like, hey, okay, give me $20 and you can have mine. That's how they started.
Probably wait until the train goes by. The workman I can pot down. I can't pot down that train. My God, it's a big train. That always struck me how, it seems so much in history that they end up with the most beautiful parts of the country. They put the train you can see it.
Well, for me, my grandfather worked for the Cotton Belt Railroad for 30 years. I love the sound of the freight train. That's why I live next to it. I can sit here and watch the trains go by, riverboats go by, and traffic on the bridge. It's sort of one man's treasure is another man's trash,
Well, my wife and I, we chose to live, along a road route because we like noise. Mm-hmm. We like, she's from a city and I'm from a city mostly, and we both go insane on a farm. Silence.
Yeah, everybody wants a quiet place in the country. For what?
Yeah. That was the thing. We just, we like to know this stuff. It's one of those, that's how it is in a lot of cities. People want to think that they're near people, but not next to people. They want it that there's just enough of awareness of being somewhere without, constantly bumping into others, and that's a tough mix. There's a picture which is shown up actually several times. People have shown me, and I've got it, which is the Rogues Gallery picture you took back in Comdex, I think it was. Was that the Comdex or CES? Where it had, two guys from Mustang, it had Fred and Terry, and you took this shot.
These people had never met before this. I got them all together at Comdex for that photo and introduced them to each other. They didn't know, they would know vaguely, by that point they were sort of competing, but they'd never met and really didn't know anything about each other's products, which again goes to kind of the mission. We found, and you can do this in an early nascent type industry. There was handfuls of people doing it. There was no money in it. It was people who worked with bulletin board systems and bulletin board software were viewed much as you might a group of people who met every Tuesday evening to exchange toothbrushes. Mm-hmm. Why do they do that? Isn't that dangerous? It was beyond eccentric. It was very French. Because there were so few and they were so infant. If we did a little thing in our little publication, if this guy had a new software product for $90 that would do such and such, he might get 300 calls in the next week. And go from it being this piece of software, he had a company. He just took in $20,000 from one mention in BoardWatch. So we could affect things, and our mission was really a pretty clear vision from very early in this publication that there should be more of this. I had a vision that the entire world should be connected, and literally a proverbial grandmother in India should be able to weave pot holders and sell them to people in New Jersey, and it should be quite inexpensive for that communication and that link to take part, so that we would move to a world where instead of having enormous corporations who dominated the television space with huge advertising budgets, and that was capitalism or entrepreneurship, that anyone should be able to sell anything to anybody, and that the costs of getting the news to them and affecting the transaction should be sufficiently minimal that you could start something in your home and sell, vacuum cleaner filters or something. Mm-hmm. By the way, I won. You get on the internet, and I bet you can find a guy that does nothing but vacuum filters. And we'll have every filter for every vacuum, and you can enter a credit card number, and your vacuum filter will show up in the thing. And that was precisely the vision. So with every issue, with everything we wrote, with everything we did, I knew where we wanted to go. And most of these people, that's where they wanted to go too. Our main technique was not to do any of it. It was to hold up a mirror so they could see each other. It's sort of a version of standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, when you're down in the swamp, it's just to get some oxygen first. Again, if you knew the techniques that other people were using to do documentaries, it short circuits a lot of the research and trial and error. And in fact, you can get in touch with other people and discuss the techniques with them. And that's how it worked. And we tried to present a mirror where they could see their own reflection, and see what each other was doing. And it worked very well. I think it accelerated the whole thing immensely.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, one of the, I think one of the effects of it, which certainly the most striking effect of it, is the 4-color ad. In an industry that doesn't, would have, usually at best you got, a little quarter-page black and white in a local newsletter, or you put up something, or you'd have a text printout. But here you have actual, in some cases there are, it starts to mature to that point of, models presenting the system, or, cartoon graphics demonstrating it, or just basically all the trappings of a mature industry start appearing very quickly within 2 or 3 years.
Well, it did start out with quarter-page black and white, hand-drawn ads and so forth. Like I say, there's no art to it. BoardWatch was not Smithsonian Magazine, even at the end. It was kind of graphics done the way I wanted to do it. But there is a concept of sort of dress for success. In order to lead the industry, you have to have one, and sometimes you have to build it. And that we viewed that as, anything we could do to help anybody doing anything was a good thing, as Martha would say. And and part of it was sort of a dress for success thing. If we talked about them as an industry and as professionals and so forth, and in some cases they would kind of sit up and look around and say, well, I guess that's true. And it was true enough. And so it accelerated the process, which was our mission. We wanted all these people to succeed. It was a shared vision of a globally networked world where individuals were empowered, if necessarily at the expense of large corporations and governments. It's a good vision. I still like it.
Well, I mean, certainly, along that line, I'll go back to the BBS con, but along that line, you buy into internet very quickly to the point that it almost comes off, I'm known for my analogies or allegories too, it's almost like, you're in charge of, this magazine about, horse and carriage, and then you suddenly discover, oh no, there's cars. And so now you've got this problem that you've become the leader in being the house organ, and the house organ is desperately now trying to tell people, wait, we're going in the wrong direction here, you got to go this way.
Not for me and not from my perspective. There was an outgrowth of our readership that developed this BBS-centric problem. I never bought into it or had the struggle. Bulletin boards, the World Wide Web, the Internet, it was all the same stuff to me. And I frankly still don't get it. There was a lot of controversy about our change. We never changed our name. We never made a change. Our first story on the Internet was April of 87 or 88. 6 months, whichever year it was, before the domain name system was deployed. It was another way to connect computers. We did a huge number of stories about online services that were neither internet nor what you would consider a bulletin board system. Although I've had people running those services tell me, oh yeah, really, we're a BBS too, like Prodigy, Genie, Microserve, which is later CompuServe, The Well, any of them. In fact, one of our more popular series of articles in those days, email was sort of islands of email. You could send messages to other people on the same bulletin board. In the bulletin board community, classically, they would exchange them between bulletin boards. But if you were on Genie, a commercial service, then you had to send email to someone on Genie. If you wanted to send a message to someone on CompuServe, you had to go get on CompuServe. We discovered that a lot of the kids working in these companies in the back room had snuck in and plugged it into an email backplane called the Internet. And that's mostly what the Internet was about in those days, was email. There was Telenet and FTP, but FTP is a way of downloading files, and that was not particularly unique, but the backplane nature of email, and we saw the Internet as just that, an email backplane that you could plug a bulletin board into, you could plug Genie into, you could plug CompuServe into, and it would bridge the email. And we did a series of articles about the hidden addressing schemes on Genie and CompuServe and so forth. These were not products. They were just ways that some of the guys in those companies had rigged to port email so they could send email over the Internet to the school or, wherever they came from. And we kind of busted the game. Here's how you can send Internet mail on Genie. And, I'd heard from Genie and these other companies, you can't tell people that. That's they're not authorized to do that. I don't know what they're authorized to do, but I can tell them anything I want to. So we described how to basically put in a little escape codes and stuff into the address where it would bounce out and get processed out to the internet, and even and we did a matrix. It was different depending on the destination too. If you want to send it from Genie to CompuServe, here's how you do it. You want to send it from CompuServe to the source, here's how you do it. If you want to send it from the well to this one, and so on and so forth. And those were very popular. So our participation editorially on the internet predated most of the, quote, BBS people who took that as a separate thing. And they came years later. All the guys that I started out writing for, Tom Jennings and Tim Pozar started the little garden out in San Francisco. Tom Jennings and I went out with a spool of Ethernet cable at midnight one night in San Francisco and ran it across this parking lot because they were paving it the next day. And he was FidoNet, but he was just, hey, here's the computer, here's another computer, let's hook them up. And he'd do it with smoke signals if he could get it to do it at a fast enough data rate. And that was sort of my attitude, and really every pioneer in the business, that was their attitude. There was no particular religion about a certain software or way of doing it. A modem was one way, and an Ethernet cable was another way, and the internet was good. And in fact, John Quartermain rejected the whole division and wanted to lump all of it together and call it the Matrix. And he wrote a book called The Matrix, and encompassing the whole email and live protocols, file transfers, and everything worldwide, using almost any methodology as the Matrix. And I thought it was a good idea, but the name didn't catch on. It became the Internet anyway. So the divisions between the Internet and FidoNet and other bulletin boards and so forth were largely mental constructs of some of the adherents. There was no magic or religion to how you connected things other than faster was better.
Did you ever, this one you don't have to answer if you don't want to, I mean, did you have a personal perception of the non-commercial types that pervaded the BBS environment? I mean, because they are antithetical to many of the goals you're looking for in terms of, you want more interactivity with different ones, fee structures for software, I mean...
Give me a...
In other words, I have talked to people, mostly in email actually, mostly for email, who see the charging for BBS software and the charging for using a BBS and so on is antithetical to the principles of a BBS. And I think it's what you're running into with some things like that. So when they see, that idea that it's a commercial thing, they see ruination as opposed to the goals, and that is antithetical to how you and Phil and the other guys who. I mean, that's not really on your radar. You're not being seen as committing. You don't think of yourself as committing a sin. You think of yourself as actually committing a virtue. You're making things better.
Yeah, I do. It's just a different approach to things. I guess I vaguely talked of them as the fuzzy people. Now, I don't know why I came up with that term, other than that they tend to have beards, and they tended to vibrate when you were talking to them. They moved a lot, and so I could never focus on them, so I called them the fuzzy people. They didn't know what they wanted. They didn't know how to get that, and they knew somebody else was going to get it first. In my world, or Phil's world, economics and money and capitalism and entrepreneurship is how you sort out the winners from the losers. If you have a product and 100 people will give you $10 for it, and then 1,000 people will give you $10 for it, it must be of some value. Otherwise, why would they do it? If you have a product that's free and nothing comes of it, and you don't even know how many people are using it, what was it? And then how would you extend it? Or why would you extend it? And so there was always a cadre of, I thought of them as sort of wacko fringe people. I called the fuzzy people, who wanted everything to be free and everything to somehow organize itself. And now you have trucks.
It is a truck convoy of loud trucks whose entire purpose is to be loud, it looks like. Wow.
So I never did understand them. We got to where we accommodated them. Sometimes they would show up coming to BBS Con or ISP Con and want to organize things and have a club. And I'd look at it, I still didn't get it. But okay, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. Here's a room, and here's some potato chips and stuff, and just vote yourselves all crazy. It's great. Sure, we can support that. Tell me what it is again that you're going to do if all that came to pass. Well, we're going to have an association. And we had 2 associations a year the whole time, if nothing, redux on a biannual basis. And they were constantly going to get together and vote, and I never did get it. I don't think that way, and I'm more, if you're going to do something, go do it. An individual can do something. You don't need a group and a club. And if anyone notices and cares, do it again. And why shouldn't you sell it? How would you know it had any value? So I was not part of the, and the problem is that many of the heroes of these guys are no different. Tom Jennings was certainly out of the box thinker in not just what he said, but the way he lived. He, for a while, lived a very minimalist existence in San Francisco on virtually no money. Was a heavy anarchist, as you say. I'm kind of a libertarian, so that was very nearly common ground. A little bit different labels, but he went on and started the little garden and sold it out years later, for a pretty good chunk of cash. Allowing him, the last I heard, to go off and work on his propane car. That's so. It's again. No, I didn't have a whole lot of a problem with them. I didn't understand them, and they were very, I think, small group of a thing. But yeah, there was constantly a group wanting to. I never did know what they wanted to do exactly, other than that it should be free and you shouldn't make money on it.
Okay. Along that line, was there ever a request that Boardwatch do something that makes no that, like from your readership, a request to do something that just made no sense along that line, like to have you, like that the board should, I don't know, anything like they requested that it includes something about something, or that BBS Con cover something, or that.
Oh, constantly. Again, everybody in this emerging industry or emerging movement, and I think it was more than an industry. There was some fervor there among everybody, with different variations of a common vision, and an immense number of people that contributed to it. And we were constantly in a position of individuals wanting it to go more toward their version of that vision. And this one thought it should all be this way. You can pick anything. The PC board people in Mustang Software thought that to do a multi-line bulletin board, you should have multiple lines and a computer on each one of them hooked up with a LAN. Phil and TBBS and the Lactcom guys, why would you do that? You should have one computer and it should service 64 lines, 128 lines. 512 lines off one PC. And they make it more or less do that. So everyone had some version of their vision as sort of the man in the middle, or the guy holding the mirror. It was a constant influx of, no, it should be held a little bit more this way. No, it should be held a little bit more this way. No, it should be a little bit more that way. And that was just absolutely part of it. And I never really chafed under it, and I understood the dynamic, and didn't have a problem with it at all. That's the basis of human nature. And one of the most rewarding things for me in doing all of this was that over a period of 12 years, I saw many products introduced. I saw many good ideas introduced that failed, some flawed ideas that succeeded, and got kind of a ringside seat to see both the ideas, the products, the execution, and the people involved with them all happen. And I learned that things happen mostly because people want them to. And that the human beings involved are more important than whether the idea was good or even whether it was particularly well executed. And that did get me kind of in tune with what people were going to want, what would work and what wouldn't work, and what needed to happen for a particular thing to work. By the end of that, it was sufficiently tuned, people thought I could tell the future. And to this day, I mean, I get calls from people wanting to know, well, what's going to happen next. And I can't say that I ever had any gift of prophecy in a mystical sense, but I did understand the drivers, the human desires and wants and needs that would make this go this direction, as opposed to over here. And that was very, but I actively and at some extensive daily effort studied that along the way. That's kind of what I got out of Board Watch. Why do things work? Why does one thing work and another thing doesn't work? And how does that work?
Well, you certainly have. You certainly have a reputation of being prescient because a lot of the things you guess come true, and most markedly, you sold the magazine. I mean, it compresses when people think in people's minds, it's almost, you sell the magazine just before the bottom completely drops out. There's actually maybe a year more go or two before things really start to go sour, but it really feels like you were like pushing for everything, and then you were like, bye. And it was, and then when you do it, and the guys who grab it, it's like, the gold coins turn to dust in their hands within a couple of years.
Yeah, and it's not in my commercial interest to dissuade anybody to any of that, but on my departure, I said all along, once it's built, I'm not interested in it. And a lot of the things that you've heard and are relating is there's a pioneering aspect to this, and then there's a plug-and-play version. Once bulletin board software per se is something you can buy at Best Buy or Software, etc., and put on a PC and for a few dollars have a bulletin board system, I don't have any interest in that. When it's being developed and nobody knows what it's going to look like in the end, and it's got dynamic individuals who are doing this on a shoestring and writing code into the night, it's fascinating. I live for it. The internet, the bulletin boards, the making the PC a communication device, we won. Now, will there be further developments? Sure. I could write articles about the internet forever. But at some point, it's anybody can do this. It's a commodity at that point. At one point, the most common question we got on the phone was from money people and investors and so forth wanting to know, well, how do they make any money doing this? And I tell them, well, they don't. And they go away. Well, one year they did. And all of a sudden, it got to be Wall Street money guys that were on my phone mostly, not technical innovators and entrepreneurs. People were raising $100 million on a 16-page paper plan for something that was goofy. It was done. It was a stupid idea and nobody needed it. At that point, I'm kind of out of here. It's a different thing. The townies have moved in. We're not on the prairie here. There's no Dodge City, right? This is all townies. And so they don't need me, and I'll move along and go find something more interesting. And I had been fairly clear about that, not from the first issue, but certainly a couple years into it, that, once this is built, I'm done. And it reached a certain level of build, and I had too many employees and too many lawyers, and my own company had gotten too big for me. I didn't enjoy being there anymore. As to it turning to a sack of dust after I sold it, it was purely a function of execution. These guys just bobbled everything about it. There's still an ISP community. In fact, I'm looking at it right now as while there was this big bubble that I got out in '98, and within a year it was starting to come unraveled as far as the internet and money thing and the stock prices and so forth. I think we're past that now, and there's a huge opportunity out there. I went to a conference of wireless internet service providers a couple of months ago, at a huge energy level, and dramatic things that are being done with radios that weren't designed to do that, guy. And they're supposed to transmit data across the room, not 70 miles across the valley. And they're doing it. So I think that if you want some more prescience by the end of this year, this wireless thing is going to eat all in its path. It's just about to explode completely. And it's kind of exciting.
All right, that's the first tape. You can go as many tapes as you're comfortable with. Any